Welcome to this Vital Health podcast. I'm Dwayne Schultes, the CEO of Vital Transformation. In this best of edition, we're looking back at two of our most important conversations on the future of generic and biosimilar medicines in the United States. Patrick Kelly is the Chief Advocacy Officer at the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. Patrick and I discuss why prices set artificially low will create pressure throughout the medicine supply chain in a market that already has little room to absorb low prices. So 90% of the medicines that are sold in the United States are generic, wholesale. They'll be charged with marginal cost is very key to all this. And yet all the focus in the media is on branded medicines. I guess that means that everything's working fine with generics and there's no problem at all, right? Everything's good?
Interesting point there. Ellie, and you are absolutely right. 90% of all medicines dispensed in this country are generic medicines. But if you look at the dollars, it's a very different scale. So the vast majority of the dollars are spent on branded medicines. The fact that they have the resources through their sales to basically invest in infrastructure is why we don't see as many shortages in the branded medicine side of the continuum as we do possibly on the generic side because of the low costs.
In 2023, there were a slew of legislative proposals, discussions, a lot of heat around the issue of shortages that you've just brought up. Why has there been an increasing risk of shortages, and why specifically does this live in generics and not the brands?
Shortages are bound to happen. There are always going to be either natural disasters that will take a manufacturing facility offline. We had one here in the United States 2 years ago with Hurricane Helene that took a Baxter facility out in North Carolina that had a pretty substantial impact on a certain number of sterile injectables that Baxter manufactured in the U.S. So there's always going to be the potential for shortages. I think we're coming through a last several years were an acute spike in a number of shortages, I think in large part due to the response to the COVID pandemic. So we put in place in the United States a significant number of dispensations for telemedicine prescribing. So we saw a significant spike in demand for product that basically strained existing supply chains because, particularly for controlled substances, there was a significant run on ADHD medicines because the people no longer had to physically go to their doctor's office, so the telemedicine provisions were put in place that allowed them to basically get their prescriptions without having to go see a doctor.
So you're saying it was a demand spike?
It was a demand spike that then basically, because it was a controlled substance, then you have to bring in the DEA, which controls all medicines that are controlled substances, et cetera. So we had a demand spike challenge there for those medicines. We've had some disruptions in the chemotherapy agent area. That was primarily due to the fact that one manufacturer had about a quarter of the marketplace for all chemotherapy agents. That facility got shut down by FDA due to quality issues. So you take a quarter of the global manufacturing capacity and you take it offline, you are going to create a epic shortage. And we saw a significant shortage for chemotherapy medicines, and that I think was resolved pretty much at the end of 2024.
So essentially what we're looking at is one manufacturer's got a substantial part of the global supply chain. And are we in a situation now where there's too much concentration because of price pressure?
It is a challenge, pricing pressure, particularly in generic medicines. It is, and I hate to say this, it's a race to the bottom. So the first generic entrant to a marketplace will have 180 days of exclusivity, and then all subsequent entrants, it's just basically the only way they can compete is on price. So as the second or third or fourth or 10th generic entrant on a particular molecule is going to drive the price down. As the price goes down, the manufacturers, maybe the ones that have the best capacity to manufacture product, are going to get out of the marketplace because there's no more market there price-wise. So you see the more established manufacturers in the generic space, the Tevas and the maybe the Viatris's of the world, are going to exit the market because the margins are so low. In some cases, they're just loss leaders for the companies. The companies are just going to bottom the market in hopes that while they can't really justify a return at the rate that they're quoting, they're hoping that other entities will get out of the marketplace so that their market share can go up at the ridiculously low price.
I mean, in perfect markets, there is always a meeting of supply to marginal cost. I mean, eventually everyone will produce at marginal cost, and whoever has the lowest marginal cost wins. I mean, that sounds like what we're getting into. The problem is we're in a post-COVID world, and there's a desire to onshore and reshore a lot of manufacturing back here. However, there's also increasing, as we've heard from the Trump administration and the continuing announcements, there's a desire to lower the cost of medicines. That seems to me an impossible square to circle or circle to square or whatever you want to call it. How are we going to deal with that, Patrick? How do we make that work? Is that possible?
To borrow an algorithm, it's an inconvenient truth. The reality is that you cannot produce medicines, any product. It doesn't have to be medicines. You cannot produce products in the United States as cheaply as you can in other marketplaces, particularly in the Asian economies, where the cost of labor, the cost of permitting, the cost of facilities is a fraction of what it is in the United States. Now, fully understand particularly the Trump administration's interest in reshoring some of that capacity. That is a national security concern for this country. And by all means, we should have more of that capacity onshore, nearshore, friendshore, whatever shore we want to call it, nearby. So that is definitely still a major focal point for this administration. Can it be done at lower cost? It cannot. Those are two inexorable realities, is basically you cannot do it at current cost in the United States without spending more.
Because these margins right now are razor thin. I mean, we're talking 0.1%. I mean, these are extremely, extremely tight margins. The only way you're going to be able to do that is to make the margins larger. Ergo, costs would have to go up. I mean, is there a reality dart being thrown here where people are buying into this? Do they get this?
Whether they get it or not, we are conveying that message. And we're supportive. And we've told the administration in the past, we are supportive of basically increasing domestic production capabilities, particularly for pharmaceutical products, because they are a national security need for this country and our warfighters. But we have to realize that it's going to require an investment, and it is going to result in a higher priced product at the end of the pipeline, which could take literally a decade to build up the capacity that we need to service at least the needs that we have. But it's going to be at a higher price. And you do have this administration focused on now lowering prices across the board with this most favored nation pricing initiative that's underway. But we also, on the other hand, have tariffs being threatened against other countries and products in particular categories, which, again, would raise prices. So there's a lot of dissonance in the policy realm right now with regard to how does this all work? And we're as confused as everybody else.
Patrick, I'd like to drill into a bit on the tariff discussion here. Now, your distributors, your members, are paid as a percentage of the contract as the deliverable, right? So essentially they're taking a micro slice of an already razor thin margin, essentially. So this is a very, very, very tightly squeezed market with not much headroom to play with margin here. Tariffs are starting to hit. And we were seeing 35% in some markets, 100% in some markets. What's going to happen if we're taking something that basically has no margin and throwing a 35% margin on it? What's the impact of that?
At face value, if you're going to increase the cost of a product by 35%, that will move its way down through the supply chain to ultimately the patient if we're looking at drugs in this country. I've yet to see any of those tariffs be imposed on existing pharmaceutical products. They've all been rumored. The president has stated it's a matter of when, but not if those get applied. The question is, I think from our perspective, we're second in line. Those tariffs will hit the manufacturers. The manufacturers will then have to determine whether they're going to increase their prices as a result of the tariff or not. I think the administration expects the manufacturers to eat those tariffs and keep costs the same. And I think that may be an unrealistic expectation. That is not only unrealistic, it's an unfeasible expectation for generic manufacturers. So if right now there's talk of a 50% tariff threshold on all products coming out of India, because I think the president is frustrated with Prime Minister Modi with regard to purchasing Russian oil, et cetera, economic alliances.
They're acting as a gray market for Russian oil for the EU, and he's trying to shut that market, which I get, but you're going to get sucked into this fight.
So if that 50% threshold is imposed on pharmaceutical products, and it's the vast majority of the pharmaceuticals coming out of India are generic products, and given the threshold and the margins on generic products, a 50% increase is untenable for the manufacturers. They would be left with no choice but to add that tariff onto the cost of their medicines, which would then spike by 50% or whatever the tariff threshold is, the acquisition cost for the wholesalers, which would then ultimately, unfortunately, have to be passed down because given the margins that both the wholesalers and the generic companies operate at, there's no way they can absorb those costs.
Yeah, Stephen Moran of the Council of Economic Advisors, he's the chair of that group. He's justified the use of tariffs. He wrote a report saying that distributors and middlemen generally absorb the cost, and he's used steel and automotive industries as examples for that, and that may be true. Is the juice even there to squeeze in the generic sector? I mean, again, where is this 35 going to come from, this 35%?
I don't think it is. And we're waiting to see this all materialize because I think we're waiting to see the Section 232 investigation that the Department of Commerce was tasked with undertaking, which would met out our potential national security risk from being dependent on foreign countries for the bulk of the medicines that we consume here in the United States. And then the tariff strategy, or at least the sectoral tariffs on pharmaceuticals, would be then determined by that investigation. We've yet to see any of that. We haven't seen the 232 investigation. We don't know basically what they're going to apply. The one peek under the screen here that we've been able to see is the recent announcement of the European Union trade agreement,
right.
U.S. trade agreement. In that trade agreement, pharmaceuticals were specifically referenced, but it was basically left to branded pharmaceuticals would be tariffed at a 15% threshold. Generics and generic precursor ingredients were exempt from the tariff. So if that holds true, and I think there is a lot of understanding within this government that generic industry cannot sustain even probably a single percentage point increase in duties or tariffs, that they may exempt those products from potential tariffs, and then the brand industry would be left to shoulder the entire brunt of those tariffs. And again, if they are imposed, and we've yet to see anything finalized yet.
The 232 investigation is ongoing, but from what I understand, that's dealing more with competition related to Ireland and taxation. It would seem that the generic sector, your members, would not fall afoul of this. It would seem hard to get stuck in that fishing net, I would think.
To be clear, our members we would basically be dealing with whatever manufacturer we deal with now, because we purchase product directly from manufacturers and then move it through to the supply chain, the provider community. So we're the pharmacy, the hospital, the physician practice, et cetera, would be the purchasers of the product. So if the manufacturers increase their prices, those prices will flow through to the next entity, which would be us, and then the subsequent entities would also have to see their prices increase to accommodate the price that the manufacturer increases their product by.
If you increased distribution by 50% of the cost of distribution, would the hospitals be willing to accept that? Would the insurers be willing to take it on? What would happen?
Many of these relationships are contractual.
Yeah, of course.
So we have a set price for a set period of time, and we're not going to pay a penny over that price for a period of time. Now, every one of those has a price depreciation provision that says if a lower price is available, we will chase that price lower immediately. But there is not a parallel provision that says if the price increases, we will move up to that increased price, regardless of the reality, whether that's a government-imposed tariff or another price increase.
John Murphy is the president and CEO of the Association for Accessible Medicines. John and I discuss how the generic and biosimilar markets currently see shortages and why pricing pressures stifle supply chain redundancies in the United States. Now, 90% of the drugs that are sold in the United States just on raw volume are generics and biosimilars. You've also said that the U.S. really drives basically everything down to marginal cost of production. Is that just what it boils down to? Are these shortages being caused because of the pricing pressure that it's just you end up with such a concentration?
The vast majority of shortages that we see in the U.S. market, it's about 200 or so products listed on the FDA's tracking database of shortages. 90% of those are older, small molecule, and sterile injectable products that are priced in the U.S. market at less than $1. So, when you run the math on that, everybody in the supply chain who makes medicines is going to have to invest in upgrading their facilities, in getting ahead of quality issues as machines age. Richard Sainer, the CEO of Sandoz, famously talks about how he sells antibiotics into the U.S. market for less than a pack of M&Ms. And that's because the market is so consolidated on the purchaser side that they can effectively monopolize their purchasing practices and drive products to the bottom. It becomes unprofitable, or even selling products at cost of goods in some of those commoditized markets is challenging. And so you see shortages in areas where let's say a plant goes offline because an older machine needs to be upgraded, you've amortized it across its life, and you look at the cost of purchasing a new sterile injectable machine for the US market, you say, it's going to take me 40 years to return that investment based on what I get paid for this product. It'd be better for me to just pivot to a different line of service where I can maybe go upstream to a new, more profitable, complex generic, or I can look in the European market or the Canadian market. And so what we're seeing is people are exiting the market in some of these older commoditized products because it's just not worth it to reinvest in the upgrades that are necessary. And at least for the AAM members, nobody wants to sell a subpar product. There's obviously quality issues that we can discuss that are in pockets of the market, but largely, people will say, well, these patients are the ones that take it. And so the shortage issue is one that we have to tackle from an economic standpoint, right? There was a study that Aaron Kesselheim did, yours and my favorite physician at Harvard.
No comment.
But Aaron did a really good job in this study because what they looked at is they just looked at what is going on with drug shortages in the United States. And let's pick 100 products and evaluate the shortage situation here in the US. And then look at those 100 products in the European Union, look at those 100 products in the Canadian market. And lo and behold, what Dr. Kesselheim and his authors found was there are actually really not shortage issues in Canada and Europe with those same products. It's only in the US. And the best they could come up with is the fact that there's enough of a cushion in the sales price of those products in Canada and Europe that manufacturers can keep those products online. And in the US, when you look at the market dynamics, they can't do it.
Well, this gets to what you and I have been arguing a lot over the last several years, that eventually if you drive price down, you get less of something. I mean, it's just simple economics, John.
That's right. And we talk a lot about in Congress and in the regulatory agencies. And what I try and be very clear about is I'm not saying we need to spend gross dollars additional to bring this cost up. What we do is we need to make sure that the fact that when a manufacturer sells $100 million of generic product into the US market, they get about 20 million back. And the delta is eaten by the system, right? From rebates, from generic pricing pressures, from PBM fees or GPO fees, depending on what market. And this is kind of true of the PBM advocacy on the brand side too, right? Like we have to figure out a way where more of the value goes to the manufacturer of the medicine and the product still ultimately ends up in the hands of the patient, and everything in the middle there kind of gets adjusted so that it is a more reasonable return on the investment for the generic manufacturer to actually make this market something that we want to sustain.
Well, the semiconductor industry had the same exact problem where the volumes just got so huge and the margins got so small that everything exited and everything went to Asia because it was low cost. Kyle Bass, the investor, calls it bending down in front of a bulldozer to pick up a dime. It's a really good analogy. One of the knock-on effects of that, as we've seen, and you mentioned this, we've seen a lot of shortages in the sterile injectables and the oncology products, et cetera.
Yeah, so I think on the large part, the cost of manufacturing in the sterile environment is higher than in some of the more commoditized pill circumstances. And look at the situation that happened last year in the sterile injectable space, in the saline space specifically, right? So Baxter produces about 90% of the sterile saline necessary for U.S. surgeries. They do it in the U.S., by the way, not to get too political, but it's made here. It's made in North Carolina. What happened in North Carolina last year with the hurricanes is it wiped off the ability for that plant to operate for a long period of time because the roads were knocked out. All of the Baxter employees had, home issues they had to deal with. And that plant went offline for a significant period of time. What we realized in the broader market was, where are we going to get salines for surgeries? Like early on after that hurricane hit, remember they were canceling surgeries. We were looking at elective surgeries being pushed off. And ultimately, FDA had to exercise its import authority and start importing saline from China and India. And that's not a knock. But what happened was I think a lot of the health policy community woke up and realized it actually isn't about where we make it. It's about the fact that we pay so little for it. There's no way to invest in redundancy, right? 70% of sterile saline supply being manufactured in one facility. And the question is, why was it in one facility? Well, we don't pay enough for it to be made in a lot of facilities.
The economics dictated that it was in one place. That's the reality.
Exactly right. And they were meeting demand, right? It's not like there were shortages prior to so we weren't shouting, oh my gosh, we have to have more. We had adequate supply. And, you had other manufacturers in the space, Fresenius Kabi, B. Braun, who were making up the supply. But then even for them to ramp up, well, if I want to run 24-hour continuous manufacturing, guess what? I need people to work in those plants in the middle of the night. And what I hear from folks is like, look, it's hard to run a third and a fourth shift in some of these communities. People don't want to work then. And so I'm not trying to be negative about the work ethic of the United States. I just think it's a practical reality that In the sterile injectable space, the cost of error is like you can't inject somebody with a subpar product. You just can't do it, right? These are clean room manufacturing facilities. They have high levels of sterility and all that. And by the way, for sterile saline, we pay like 25 cents for those bags in the hospital setting. So that old adage of squeezing the balloon, right? Like something has to give. And what gives is, well, then we're going to have to make it all in a very optimized process in one facility. Western North Carolina wasn't the kind of place you associated with a Category 5 hurricane knocking out all the roads, but lo and behold, it happened. And that really woke a lot of folks up to this idea that actually we need to pay for redundancy because that's where the health security comes into play.
One of the other things we've been seeing, and you mentioned this in your introduction, is the issue with biosimilars. Now, we've known about the challenges about market access around biosimilars and also consolidation around off-patent brands that still control a lot of the market space. But one of the other things we're seeing now are insurers are starting to produce their own proprietary biosimilars. We're seeing a lot of this occur. Why do you think this is occurring in the biosimilar space in particular?
The insurers and the PBMs see a market opportunity for them to squeeze additional value out of their stranglehold in the supply chain. And for them, they're saying, well, look, I'm paying ASP plus what for Humira? There's 10 biosimilars on the market, which are creating downward pricing pressure. You know what I should do is just contract manufacture one under my own brand name and only prefer that product. I have vertically integrated completely.
They are starting to buy their own practices, though, too. They are starting to vertically integrate into the practice space, too, John.
Yeah. And so I think that AAM sort of struggles with, well, what should our position be on these sort of biosimilar programs? Because on the one hand, most of these are contract manufactured. So there's a place for biosimilar manufacturers to make these products. And it does intuitively to a health policy person say, well, actually, they're still preferring a biosimilar over a brand. Okay, that's what we want. But then the question becomes is like, but do we really want the preference to be a completely owned vertical integration by Vizient or ClarisOne or, AmerisourceBergen? Or do we want competition that actually ultimately leads to better pricing? Because the dynamic you hit on, Dwayne, and if you look at the IQVIA report we did earlier this year, people are stopping investing in future biologic loss of exclusivity products. There's $254 billion worth of LOE over the next 10 years in the biologic space itself. It's 112 products. There's only like 18 in the clinic for biosimilar development right now. And so there's this massive unintended consequence of the way that market's working, where the average biosimilar manufacturer looks at some of these products and says, it's a $300 to $400 million investment for me to get this through FDA approval, CGMP plant online. For the early biologics, which have massive patient populations, like you look at the patient population of Humira, right? It's huge. But as biologics get more targeted, that patient population comes down. You sort of look at the dynamics of the market and it becomes less and less attractive to invest in that space. And so we have to think about these private label biosimilars in the broader context of like, what do we want this market to look like in 5 years? And what we probably don't want it to look like in 5 years is 20, 30, 40-year monopolies for some of the brand manufacturers and their biologic products because there's just no incentive to compete.
Yeah, but you don't want to necessarily flip it to the insurer having their own monopoly either of the brand, and then we're saying, okay, you're going to deal with our product. From our standpoint at our firm, the reality is a lot of this is due to benefit redesign that occurred under the IRA. Now, yes, the out-of-pocket cap is great, and there's a lot of good things that came in the Inflation Reduction Act. There are many things we don't like, and obviously we've published on that. But there's a knock-on effect, and there's an unintended consequence here that people have not considered. When you change from having 80% catastrophic covered by the Medicare fund, and then you move that to 60% for the insurer, the reality is where they were making a little bit, about $500 we calculate-ish on average for the 1.5 million Americans in Medicare who are on the catastrophic side of Part D. And a lot of those drugs, unfortunately, do have biologic spillovers. If you then look at those drugs when they go to the 60% covered by the insurer now and only 20% covered by Medicare, that goes really south, about $13,000 time of beneficiary. $13,000 times 1.5 million, you're getting into $22 billion in territory there where those are losses. And what you actually see is the only way that they can make this work is to essentially own it and rebate back to themselves and take
Yep.
that 20% Medicare margin. It's a complex math calculation and it's not easy to do, but the numbers are striking. Is the reality here that we've created essentially an annuity function for the insurers that have to do this, otherwise they're going to lose money?
I definitely don't think we did ourselves any favor in the complexity of the IRA, right? And like you think about even back to the ACA, Nancy Pelosi famously said, well, we have to pass the bill
To know what's in it.
so we can read it to know what's in it. And we're experiencing a little bit of the same hangover effect with the IRA and some of these, because as you point out, Dwayne, aspects of the coverage redesign and aspects of the reinsurance modeling, they were super complicated. There probably wasn't a single person who understood the entirety of what was going to happen in the market, right? The insurance folks understood what their liabilities were. The brand folks understood what their liabilities were. But there was nobody at the top to say, well, what is this ultimately going to mean for the market? And now we're sort of living it. And I'll add another one, in the biologic space, for instance, there's an aspect of the IRA that talked about how you weren't going to negotiate a product that had biosimilar competition. And then CMS sort of went completely haywire in how it interpreted the implication of that provision. Stelara is a good example, right? Stelara is a negotiated drug with 3 biosimilars that were all clearly in the pipeline prior to that selection. And the signaling effect to the broader market is, well, I've got to make a determination from an asset categorization standpoint that I'm going to invest $300 million over a 5 to 8 year period to get my biosimilar to the market. And I have absolutely no idea what the government mandated price is going to be when that asset gets to FDA approval and gets on the market. How do I run an NPV analysis and evaluate what my investment calculus looks like? Better for me to just go to a different product.
Yeah.
Right. Or go into complex generic space.
And if you're an insurer, you've said, okay, I've got $70,000 of rebate I've been getting per Stelara script, which we calculate in the ballpark they were getting. That goes away. Okay, now I don't know what I'm going to be dealing with because we have no clarity here from CMS how they're negotiating this exemption, which you're right, by the letter of the law, there were 3 there ready to go, but they ignored it. But the reality is if you're an insurer, it's like, okay, I can deal with all this uncertainty or I can just own it and then I get it and then I vertically integrate and boom, I know my math. I know what I'm looking at.
And ultimately, what we don't know, you hit on it first, I'm inherently skeptical of the insurance market sort of owning the entirety of the stack, right, from provider to researcher, because I'm not entirely sure. And in fact, we've gone through this when we passed the Sherman Act and everything back in the 20s, because we said, we understand that completely dominating a supply chain is inherently bad for the end consumer. And one of the aspects of both Hatch-Waxman and BPCIA was Congress said, we actually don't want these sorts of monopolies. We want to have competition that ultimately results in better patient access, more patient choice. And instead, what we're seeing is kind of some of the opposite, where we're starting to see more of this vertical integration in the supply. It's a challenge. Long story short, my objective in pursuing some of these legislative actions at AAM is to say, it's not just about the economics of reimbursing for generic drugs. It's about, we really need to have a conversation in this country is, what do we want this healthcare market to look like in the next 15 to 20 years? And by the way, if we wanted to do it right, it's going to require some hard decisions, but also some very bold leadership on the part of Congress to say, we actually do want to reform the market. I don't necessarily have a good answer as to what the right market is, because probably never going to get to a place where we have a completely sole single payer option in the US. I think there's way too much difficulty in that. And I'm not even sure if we want that, right? But I do think we have to start saying, every time we do health legislation on the Hill that relates to the insurance market, it's either a very minor thing that does nothing, or it's a very complex thing that nobody's really stopped to appreciate what the second and third order effects will be. And I think that's where we find ourselves today.
Yesterday, the Trump administration made an announcement with Pfizer that they would be pursuing an agreement under most favored nations. Pfizer is going to offer the same price in the U.S. in Medicaid as it has internationally for the price they provide abroad. John, what are the broader implications for most favored nations given the statute of the agreement, at least as it's been announced?
I approach, as representing the generic industry, most favored nation, similar to the way I approached IRA, which is to say, a competitive market is a better solution to lowering costs than the government simply deciding what it's going to pay. On the one hand, that's really important for us to have as a level set, because I don't think Medicare most favored nation is going to get us magically to a place where drug prices are more affordable for the patient when they actually go pick it up. And I watched the president speak yesterday. I watched Albert Bourla speak yesterday. I've looked at the press. Unfortunately, I can't help but take away a little bit from this of seeing this expansion of direct-to-consumer pricing for brand drugs, this access at cash pay, to saying, I guess we're giving up on fixing the patient experience with its insurance company. Is that really where we're going? Because I find it hard to believe. And by the way, I'm not knocking what Pfizer's doing. What I'm kind of looking at this and I'm saying, I'm in the process, because I run a company now, I just got all the insurance information for what AAM's health plan is going to look like next year.
Premiums went up, right, John? Premiums went up.
The best we're doing is we're saying my premiums are going to go up 18% for AAM's employees next year. If we don't pass ACA subsidy reform, premiums are going to go up 28 to 30% for a lot of people in the exchanges that have subsidies. And by the way, we're kind of moving to a model where if you need a brand drug, you can actually just pay cash for it on this website. So what's the purpose of insurance having a prescription drug benefit at that point? And by the way, I look at some of the rates that are starting to be charged by some of these brand manufacturers, and they are significant discounts. But to the average American, $3,800 a month, like they're supposed to be having insurance that pays for that. And so I am a little bit dissatisfied as a consumer in the fact that you watch this and I say, we have to address the Medicaid issue. The 340B issue is a complete disaster. And it was good for Pfizer to focus on that. And the solution isn't to just make these products available direct to consumer for cash. We all owe more of a discussion about insurance reform. It's a positive to see the administration saying tacitly, we do want to address the fact that we pay more for a lot of drugs in the US than the Europeans do. How we get to fixing that is probably not going to be easy. It's certainly not going to be by just having government mandated price controls. And so it was good to see that we seem to be moving away from that based on the announcement yesterday. My anticipation, there'll be a couple of other companies that come in and announce that. We're seeing a more moderative effect to the tariff environment in the pharma space, which is also a net positive for American patients. I just can't help but have this nagging concern that we're going to see a big direct-to-consumer push on a lot of expensive medicines, and then the government's going to say, we did our job. We don't have to do anything else.
The executive producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Dwayne Schultes. Editing by Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation LLC, copyright 2026.